On a cloudless morning in August 1981, somewhere above the Baltic Sea and just beyond the 12-mile limit of Soviet territorial waters, a modified Boeing airliner bearing United States Air Force markings maintained its orbit at 37,000 feet, its four turbofan engines producing a low, steady drone audible only to the crew sealed inside the pressurized fuselage. From the ground, Soviet radar operators tracked the aircraft with the same mixture of irritation and impotence they had felt for nearly 2 decades, watching the electronic signature move in slow, deliberate circles just outside the reach of their surface-to-air missile batteries. The aircraft was an RC-135V Rivet Joint, tail number obscured by operational security, and inside its aluminum skin, 24 linguists, signals analysts, electronic warfare officers, and airborne systems maintenance specialists worked in near silence, their headsets pressed tight against their ears, their instruments tracing invisible rivers of electromagnetic energy that flowed from hundreds of emitters scattered across the Soviet military command structure below. What the Soviets did not know, what their commanders in Moscow and Leningrad refused to believe, was that every encrypted radio transmission, every burst of telemetry from a mobile missile battery, every frequency-hopping signal sent from a forward command post to a squadron of MiG interceptors, was being captured, decoded, geolocated, and forwarded in near real time to American intelligence centers, where analysts could read Soviet operational plans as clearly as if they had been typed on paper and handed over by a defector. For more than 4 decades, the Soviet Union and its successors invested billions of rubles in communications security, deploying encrypted radios, burst transmission systems, frequency-agile networks, and mobile command posts designed to deny the enemy any coherent picture of the battlefield. Soviet doctrine assumed that if transmissions were brief, encrypted, and constantly relocated, no adversary could piece together the full mosaic of military operations. That assumption rested on the belief that intelligence collection was a slow, labor-intensive process requiring physical infiltration, human sources, or primitive direction-finding equipment that could be easily evaded by a disciplined signals discipline. What Soviet planners failed to anticipate was the creation of a flying electronic intelligence factory capable of vacuuming up signals across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, processing them aboard the aircraft with cryptanalytic equipment more powerful than anything available on the ground, and transmitting the results to strike packages and national command authorities before enemy commanders even suspected their communications had been compromised. The RC-135 Rivet Joint transformed signals intelligence from a historical archive into a live battlefield weapon, and in doing so, it turned the electronic spectrum into an arena where the United States possessed absolute dominance. The origins of the RC-135 family trace back to the early 1960s, when the United States Air Force recognized that its aging fleet of RB-47 Stratojet reconnaissance aircraft, propeller-driven relics of the Korean War era, could no longer meet the demands of Cold War intelligence collection. Soviet air defenses were improving rapidly, radar-guided interceptors were proliferating, and surface-to-air missile systems were being deployed in ever greater numbers around the periphery of the Warsaw Pact. The Air Force needed a platform that could loiter for hours at high altitude, remain beyond the reach of hostile interceptors, carry a crew large enough to operate complex electronic systems, and deliver intelligence in time to influence operational decisions. The solution was to modify the KC-135 Stratotanker, itself a derivative of the Boeing 707 commercial airliner, into a series of specialized reconnaissance variants capable of performing signals intelligence, electronic intelligence, and measurement and signature intelligence missions. The first operational RC-135 variant entered service in 1962, and over the following 2 decades, the fleet evolved through a bewildering array of subtypes, each designated by a different letter suffix and each configured for a specific intelligence mission. The RC-135C Big Team, the RC-135D Office Boy, the RC-135M Rivet Card, and the RC-135U Combat Cent all contributed to the collective knowledge base that allowed American commanders to understand the Soviet military machine in granular detail. But it was the RC-135V and RC-135W Rivet Joint variants, introduced in the late 1970s and continuously upgraded ever since, that became the backbone of American airborne signals intelligence. The Rivet Joint configuration represented a quantum leap in capability over earlier reconnaissance aircraft, not merely because of its sensor suite, though that was formidable, but because of the way it integrated collection, analysis, and dissemination into a single airborne platform. Earlier signals intelligence aircraft collected raw intercepts and recorded them on magnetic tape for later analysis by ground-based specialists, a process that could take hours or days and rendered the intelligence useless for time-sensitive targeting. Rivet Joint, by contrast, carried its own team of cryptologic linguists and electronic warfare officers who could identify, translate, and analyze intercepted communications in real time, passing actionable intelligence to commanders via a suite of satellite communication links, high-frequency radios, and encrypted data links that connected the aircraft to the broader theater command structure. The aircraft's primary sensors included a comprehensive array of antennas mounted along the fuselage, wingtips, and tail, each optimized for a different portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, capable of detecting and geolocating radar emissions, voice communications, data links, and telemetry signals from distances exceeding 240 kilometers. The four large blade antennas mounted on the forward fuselage, a distinctive visual signature of baseline configuration rivet joints until the mid-2000s when they were replaced by lower-profile conformal antennas, were part of the multiple communications emitter location system, a direction-finding array that allowed the crew to triangulate the location of enemy transmitters with an accuracy measured in meters, not kilometers. Underneath the fuselage, dozens of smaller antennas provided coverage across the entire radio frequency spectrum, from low-frequency communications used by ground forces to ultra-high-frequency satellite links used by air defense networks. Inside the aircraft, the reconnaissance compartment resembled a windowless operations center, rows of consoles manned by specialists staring at cascading waterfall displays that represented the real-time electromagnetic environment, each spike and peak denoting a transmission, each pattern revealing the structure of an enemy communications network. The crew typically consisted of 2 pilots, 2 navigators, 4 electronic warfare officers designated as Ravens, 14 intelligence operators responsible for monitoring specific frequency bands or geographic sectors, and 4 airborne systems engineers who maintain the complex electronic equipment during flight. Missions lasted 8 to 10 hours, and with aerial refueling from KC-135 or KC-10 tankers, the aircraft could remain on station for more than 12 hours, orbiting in a racetrack pattern that maximized coverage of the target area while remaining safely outside hostile airspace. The crew operated under mission code names that reflected the seriousness of their task. Flights were designated either Burning Wind for peacetime reconnaissance or Misty Wind for contingency operations, a semantic distinction that belied the fact that every mission, whether conducted during the Cold War or in the post-Soviet era, involved the systematic exploitation of adversary communications for strategic and tactical advantage. The strategic impact of Rivet Joint became evident during the final decade of the Cold War, when the aircraft began to provide unprecedented insight into Soviet military exercises, deployment patterns, and command relationships. During major Warsaw Pact exercises such as Zapad 81 and Zapad 83, RC-135 aircraft orbited continuously along the borders of Eastern Europe, intercepting the radio traffic between Soviet commanders and their subordinate units, mapping the flow of orders from division headquarters to regimental command posts to individual battalions, and identifying the specific frequencies and call signs used by each echelon of the Soviet command structure. American analysts discovered that despite extensive investments in communications security, Soviet forces operated under rigid procedural discipline that made their networks predictable and vulnerable. Radio operators adhered to scheduled transmission windows, commanders used standardized brevity codes that could be decoded through traffic analysis even when the content was encrypted, and mobile command posts moved along predictable routes dictated by terrain and road networks. The Rivet Joint crews compiled comprehensive electronic orders of battle that documented the location, composition, and readiness status of Soviet forces across Eastern Europe, information that would have required hundreds of human agents and years of patient espionage to acquire through traditional means. More importantly, the real-time nature of Rivet Joint collection meant that American intelligence could track changes in Soviet force posture as they happened, providing early warning of any mobilization or redeployment that might signal an impending attack. Soviet military intelligence, was not blind to the presence of American reconnaissance aircraft. Soviet radar operators routinely tracked RC-135 flights, and Soviet fighter pilots were frequently scrambled to intercept and visually identify the aircraft as they orbited along the periphery of Soviet airspace. Soviet commanders understood that the Americans were collecting signals intelligence, and they implemented countermeasures designed to deny useful information to the adversary. Radio operators were instructed to minimize transmission time, using burst transmission techniques that compressed messages into milliseconds-long pulses of radio energy that were difficult to intercept and analyze. Encryption systems were continually upgraded, with new cipher algorithms introduced at regular intervals to frustrate American cryptanalysts. Command posts were made mobile, mounted on trucks or armored vehicles that could relocate frequently to avoid being geolocated by direction-finding equipment. Yet despite these measures, Soviet signals discipline remained inconsistent, undermined by the sheer volume of communications required to coordinate a modern military force, and by human factors that no amount of training could entirely eliminate. Soldiers forgot procedures, equipment malfunctioned, and the operational tempo of exercises and real-world operations forced commanders to prioritize speed over security, transmitting in the clear when encrypted systems were unavailable, or using predictable frequencies when changing channels would have delayed critical orders. The result was a constant stream of exploitable signals that Rivet Joint crews intercepted, analyzed, and forwarded to intelligence centers at Fort Meade, Langley, and the Pentagon. If you appreciate discovering the classified technologies that gave the United States an invisible advantage during the Cold War, consider subscribing to Classified Warfare for future revelations about the systems that shaped history. The true measure of Rivet Joint's effectiveness came not during peacetime surveillance, but during combat operations, when the intelligence it provided directly influenced the outcome of battles. In January 1991, as Operation Desert Storm unfolded over Iraq and Kuwait, RC-135 aircraft maintained continuous orbits over the Persian Gulf and Saudi Arabia, their sensors tuned to the frequencies used by Iraqi air defense networks, military commanders, and Republican Guard units. The intelligence they collected allowed American strike planners to map the Iraqi integrated air defense system in exquisite detail, identifying the location of every radar site, surface-to-air missile battery, and command bunker that formed the backbone of Saddam Hussein's defensive network. When the air campaign began on the night of January 17th, the first wave of strikes targeted the command nodes and radar installations that Rivet Joint had geolocated, severing the links between Iraqi air defense commanders and the missile batteries under their control. Within hours, the Iraqi air defense system, once considered one of the densest in the world, was reduced to isolated pockets of resistance that could be methodically suppressed by coalition aircraft armed with anti-radiation missiles. Iraqi commanders, unable to coordinate their defenses or communicate with their forces, resorted to transmitting in the clear on unsecured frequencies, a decision born of desperation that only made the Rivet Joint crew's task easier. American intelligence operators listened in real time as Iraqi officers reported their positions, requested reinforcements, and described the devastation inflicted by coalition airstrikes, information that was immediately relayed to coalition command centers and used to refine subsequent targeting decisions. The Rivet Joint's ability to intercept enemy pilot communications proved equally valuable during air-to-air engagements. Iraqi fighter pilots flying Soviet-designed MiG-29 and Mirage F-1 interceptors relied on ground-controlled intercept procedures in which radar operators on the ground vectored the fighters toward incoming coalition aircraft using voice commands transmitted over radio. RC-135 crews monitored these communications, tracking the movements of Iraqi fighters and warning coalition pilots of threats before the enemy aircraft even appeared on their onboard radars. On multiple occasions, American F-15 Eagle pilots received alerts from Rivet Joint operators that Iraqi fighters were being scrambled from a specific airbase and were climbing to intercept altitude along a predicted flight path, intelligence that allowed the F-15 pilots to position themselves advantageously and engage the Iraqi aircraft with beyond visual range missiles before the enemy pilots realized they were under attack. The psychological impact of this capability on Iraqi pilots was devastating. Trained to believe that their Soviet-supplied equipment and tactics gave them a fighting chance against Western aircraft, Iraqi aviators found themselves consistently outmaneuvered and outgunned by an enemy that seemed to possess supernatural awareness of their movements. Interrogations of captured Iraqi pilots revealed a pervasive sense of helplessness, a recognition that every radio transmission, every radar emission, every electronic signal they generated was being monitored by an unseen adversary who used that information to kill them with impunity. The evolution of Rivet Joint did not end with the Cold War or the Gulf War. As potential adversaries studied American military operations and adapted their tactics, the RC-135 fleet underwent continuous modernization to maintain its edge. In the mid-2000s, the fleet completed a comprehensive upgrade known as Baseline 8, which replaced the external MUCELS antennas with conformal blade antennas that reduced radar cross-section and aerodynamic drag, improved the onboard signal processing systems to handle the exponentially increasing volume of electronic emissions generated by modern digital communications networks, and integrated new satellite communication terminals that allowed real-time dissemination of intelligence to tactical units operating deep inside hostile territory. The cockpit was modernized under the Avionics Modernization Program, replacing analog instruments with a glass cockpit configuration and installing GPS-based navigation systems that improved accuracy and reduced pilot workload. The aircraft's Pratt & Whitney TF-33 turbofan engines, relics of 1960s aerospace technology, were replaced with more efficient CFM International CFM56 engines that provided greater thrust, reduced fuel consumption, and extended the aircraft's operational range, allowing it to reach targets farther from its operating bases and remain on station longer before requiring aerial refueling. As the nature of warfare changed, so did the missions assigned to Rivet Joint. In Iraq and Afghanistan, where insurgent forces operated without sophisticated electronic systems, the aircraft's focus shifted from intercepting radar and military communications to monitoring civilian cell phone networks, commercial satellite phones, and handheld radios used by insurgent commanders to coordinate ambushes and improvised explosive device attacks. The Rivet Joint crews, working in conjunction with signals intelligence specialists on the ground, developed techniques to identify the electronic signatures of specific individuals based on their communication patterns, a capability known as network analysis that allowed American forces to map insurgent organizational structures and identify high-value targets for capture or elimination. On multiple occasions, intelligence collected by Rivet Joint aircraft led directly to the location and death of senior al-Qaeda and Taliban leaders who believed they were communicating securely. The ability to intercept and geolocate communications chatter in real time, combined with other intelligence sources such as drone surveillance and human informants, enabled the creation of detailed patterns-of-life assessments that documented where a target lived, whom he met with, and when he was most vulnerable to attack. This intelligence was passed to Special Operations Forces, who used it to plan nighttime raids that captured or killed hundreds of insurgent leaders, systematically dismantling networks that had taken years to build. The RC-135 Rivet Joint's relevance extended beyond counterinsurgency operations into the realm of great power competition. In the Pacific Theater, RC-135 aircraft based at Kadena Air Base in Okinawa conducted continuous reconnaissance missions along the coasts of China and North Korea, intercepting communications and radar missions from People's Liberation Army forces and Korean People's Army units, mapping the deployment patterns of ballistic missile systems, tracking the movements of naval vessels, and monitoring the activities of air defense networks. The intelligence collected during these missions provided American commanders with an accurate and up-to-date understanding of Chinese and North Korean military capabilities, information that informed strategic planning and allowed the United States to maintain a credible deterrent against potential aggression. In Europe, RC-135 aircraft stationed at RAF Mildenhall in the United Kingdom resumed their Cold War role of monitoring Russian military activities, orbiting along the borders of Poland and the Baltic states as Russian forces conducted exercises in Kaliningrad and Belarus. During the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, Rivet Joint aircraft maintained near-constant presence over Poland and Romania, intercepting Russian military communications and providing intelligence to Ukrainian forces who used it to target Russian command posts, supply convoys, and artillery positions with devastating accuracy. The United States never acknowledged the extent of intelligence sharing with Ukraine, but the effectiveness of Ukrainian strikes against Russian forces, particularly in the early weeks of the war when Russian columns were ambushed with uncanny precision, strongly suggested that American signals intelligence played a critical role. The operational effectiveness of Rivet Joint rested not only on its technology but on the skill and dedication of its crews, specialists who underwent months of training in cryptologic techniques, electronic warfare principles, foreign languages, and signals analysis before being certified to fly operational missions. Electronic warfare officers, known by the callsign Raven, were responsible for operating the aircraft's primary sensor systems, monitoring assigned frequency bands, identifying signals of interest, and coordinating the collection effort across the reconnaissance compartment. Intelligence operators, many of whom held advanced degrees in linguistics or regional studies, translated intercepted voice communications in real time, providing context and interpretation that transformed raw signals into actionable intelligence. Airborne systems engineers maintained the complex electronic equipment during flight, troubleshooting malfunctions and reconfiguring systems to adapt to changing mission requirements. The crews worked in cramped, windowless conditions, their only view of the outside world provided by a few small portholes near the forward galley, their attention focused entirely on the cascading displays and audio feeds that represented the electromagnetic environment below. Missions were mentally exhausting, requiring sustained concentration over periods of 8 to 12 hours, and the stress of knowing that every intercept, every geolocated transmission, every piece of intelligence forwarded to commanders might directly influence life-and-death decisions weighed heavily on the crew members who bore that responsibility. The Soviet Union and later Russia were not the only adversaries who underestimated the Rivet Joint's capabilities. North Korean military planners, confident that their use of landline communications and tightly controlled radio discipline protected their operational security, discovered to their dismay that American intelligence could still piece together an accurate picture of their force dispositions and readiness levels. In 2003, a North Korean MiG-29 interceptor came within 50 feet of an RC-135S Cobra Ball aircraft operating in international airspace over the Sea of Japan, and another North Korean fighter locked onto the aircraft with its fire control radar in preparation for a shootdown, a provocation that nearly escalated into an international incident. The North Koreans evidently believed that by intimidating American reconnaissance aircraft, they could force the United States to curtail its intelligence collection activities. Instead, the incident only reinforced American resolve, and RC-135 missions continued without interruption, their crews protected by fighter escorts and supported by electronic warfare aircraft that could jam North Korean radar systems if hostilities erupted. Iranian military commanders made similar miscalculations, assuming that by transmitting only encrypted messages and relocating their air defense radars frequently, they could deny American intelligence a clear picture of their military infrastructure. Yet during periods of heightened tension in the Persian Gulf, RC-135 aircraft orbited just outside Iranian territorial waters, intercepting the communications of Revolutionary Guard Corps units, tracking the movements of missile boats and fast attack craft, and monitoring the emissions from coastal radar installations. Intelligence that allowed the United States Navy to maintain constant situational awareness of Iranian military activities and respond immediately to any hostile action. The proliferation of advanced communications technology in the 21st century, far from rendering signals intelligence obsolete, actually expanded the opportunities for collection. As adversary forces adopted digital radios, satellite communications, and network command and control systems, the volume of electromagnetic emissions they generated increased exponentially, providing Rivet Joint crews with a richer and more detailed picture of enemy operations than ever before. Modern signal processing algorithms, enabled by advances in computing power, allowed the aircraft's onboard systems to sort through thousands of simultaneous transmissions, identify those of intelligence value, and automatically forward them to analysts on the ground for further exploitation. Machine learning techniques were applied to traffic analysis, allowing the systems to recognize patterns in communications networks and identify anomalies that might indicate an impending attack or a change in enemy strategy. The integration of Rivet Joint with other intelligence platforms, including satellites, unmanned aerial vehicles, and ground-based intercept stations, created a synergistic intelligence architecture in which each platform contributed data that enhanced the overall picture. a concept known as multi-intelligence fusion that represented the culmination of decades of investment in signals intelligence infrastructure. The United Kingdom, recognizing the irreplaceable value of airborne signals intelligence, made the strategic decision in 2010 to acquire its own fleet of RC-135W Rivet Joint aircraft to replace the aging Nimrod R-1 reconnaissance aircraft that had served the Royal Air Force since the 1970s. The British government purchased 3 former KC-135 tankers from the United States Air Force and contracted with L3 Communications to convert them to the latest Rivet Joint standard, a process that involved installing the complete suite of signals intelligence sensors, mission systems, and communications equipment that equipped American aircraft. The first British RC-135W entered service in 2013, and Royal Air Force crews began training alongside their American counterparts at Offutt Air Force Base, Nebraska, flying joint missions and participating in operations that supported both American and British national security objectives. The acquisition represented a significant investment, with a total program cost exceeding £650 million, but British defense officials considered it essential to maintaining the United Kingdom's status as a leading intelligence power. The Royal Air Force operated its RC-135W aircraft from RAF Waddington, deploying them to operations over Iraq and Syria in support of coalition action against the Islamic State, to the Baltic region in response to Russian military activities, and to the Eastern Mediterranean to monitor conflicts in Libya and Syria. The interoperability between American and British Rivet Joint forces created a transatlantic signals intelligence network that allowed the two nations to share the burden of global reconnaissance missions and provide continuous coverage of areas of mutual interest. Yet despite 6 decades of continuous operations, the existence of certain Rivet Joint capabilities remained shrouded in secrecy. The aircraft's ability to decrypt encrypted communications, a subject of intense speculation among defense analysts and foreign intelligence services, was never officially confirmed by the United States government. Though oblique references in declassified documents and the obvious utility of intercepts that included the content of encrypted messages strongly suggested that at least some encryption systems used by adversary forces could be broken in near real time by equipment aboard the aircraft or at ground stations that received data forwarded by the Rivet Joint. The specific techniques used to penetrate adversary networks, the range and sensitivity of the aircraft's direction-finding arrays, and the procedures used to disseminate intelligence to tactical units remained classified at the highest levels, protected by security classifications that prevented even members of Congress from receiving detailed briefings without extraordinary justification. This secrecy was not mere bureaucratic reflex but operational necessity, for any disclosure of specific capabilities would allow adversaries to develop effective countermeasures that might neutralize the advantage Rivet Joint provided. The psychological dimension of Rivet Joint operations, the knowledge that an unseen adversary was listening to every transmission and tracking every emitter, exerted a corrosive effect on enemy morale and operational effectiveness. Commanders who understood that their communications were being intercepted faced a dilemma: maintain radio silence and sacrifice the ability to coordinate operations effectively, or accept the risk that transmitting orders would reveal their positions and intentions to an enemy capable of exploiting that information with lethal precision. Some adversaries, paralyzed by this dilemma, descended into operational paralysis, unable to execute coordinated maneuvers for fear of giving away their plans. Others, hoping to deceive American intelligence, transmitted false information over radio channels they knew were being monitored, only to discover that American analysts, drawing on years of experience and access to multiple intelligence sources, could distinguish genuine communications from disinformation with surprising accuracy. The erosion of confidence in secure communications undermined the very foundation of modern military operations, reducing the effectiveness of even well-trained and well-equipped forces who could not trust that their orders would remain secret or that their movements would go undetected. The RC-135 Rivet Joint Fleet, as of the mid-2020s, consisted of 17 RC-135VW aircraft assigned to the 55th Wing at Offutt Air Force Base, along with 3 British RC-135W aircraft operated by No. 51 Squadron at RAF Waddington, a combined force that maintained a continuous global presence, with aircraft deployed to forward operating locations in the Pacific, Europe, the Middle East, and occasionally other regions as operational requirements dictated. The aircraft were expected to remain in service until at least the 2040s, sustained by ongoing modernization programs that continually upgraded mission systems, communications equipment, and airframe components to keep pace with evolving threats. The sheer longevity of the RC-135 program, spanning more than 6 decades from the first operational flights in the early 1960s to the present day, testified to the enduring importance of signals intelligence in modern warfare and to the unique capabilities that only a large, crewed airborne platform could provide. Proposals to replace the Rivet Joint with unmanned systems or to rely exclusively on satellite-based signals intelligence were repeatedly rejected by military planners who recognized that the flexibility, adaptability, and real-time analysis provided by a trained crew aboard the aircraft could not be replicated by automated systems or by sensors operating from space. The missions flown by Rivet Joint crews, though rarely discussed in public, shaped the course of conflicts and influenced strategic decisions at the highest levels of government. During the Cold War, the intelligence they collected informed arms control negotiations, provided early warning of Soviet military buildups, and helped American leaders understand the capabilities and intentions of an adversary whose strategic planning was shrouded in secrecy. In the post-Cold War era, Rivet Joint operations supported counterterrorism campaigns, enabled precision strikes against high-value targets, and provided situational awareness that protected American forces from ambush and attack. In an age of renewed great power competition, the aircraft continued to monitor the activities of potential adversaries, ensuring that American commanders possessed accurate and timely intelligence about the disposition and readiness of hostile forces. The men and women who served aboard these aircraft, flying long, monotonous missions in uncomfortable conditions with no expectation of public recognition, were the silent guardians of American security, their work invisible to the public but indispensable to the defense of the nation. The strategic lesson embodied by the RC-135 Rivet Joint was that in modern warfare, information dominance conferred an advantage as decisive as superior firepower or advanced technology. An adversary who could not communicate securely, whose every transmission was intercepted and geolocated, whose command structure was laid bare for the enemy to see, was an adversary fighting blind, unable to coordinate operations, unable to respond to threats, unable to adapt to changing circumstances on the battlefield. The billions of dollars invested by the Soviet Union, Russia, China, and other nations in encryption systems, frequency-hopping radios, and communications security measures proved insufficient to deny the United States the intelligence it required to maintain strategic superiority. The RC-135 Rivet Joint, an aircraft that from the outside resembled nothing more than an aging airliner, turned the electromagnetic spectrum into a weapon, transforming the invisible chatter of enemy communications into actionable intelligence that saved lives, won battles, and deterred aggression. In the end, adversaries discovered too late that the confidence they placed in their communications security was misplaced, that the secret messages they thought were protected by unbreakable codes had been read by American intelligence officers sitting in front of consoles aboard an aircraft orbiting just beyond their borders, that the mobile command posts they relocated constantly to avoid detection had been geolocated with meter-level accuracy by direction-finding antennas they never saw, and that the operational plans they transmitted in encrypted bursts had been decrypted and forwarded to American commanders before their own subordinate units received them. The arrogance that led them to believe their communications were secure collapsed when they realized that secrecy was an illusion, that every word they spoke over radio, every signal they transmitted from a radar, every byte of data they sent over a network was being captured, analyzed, and exploited by an adversary whose mastery of signals intelligence far exceeded anything they had imagined possible. The RC-135 Rivet Joint demonstrated that in the electronic battlefield of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the side that could hear everything while remaining silent held an advantage that no amount of courage or tactical skill could overcome, and that the invisible war fought in the electromagnetic spectrum was as decisive as any battle fought with bombs and bullets. Join us here at Classified Warfare as we continue to uncover the classified operations and technologies that gave the United States its invisible edge during the Cold War and beyond, revealing the systems that enemy commanders feared but could never escape.